It started with fire. On a cold December evening near the end of 2001, about 500 people gathered outside a church in Alamogordo, New Mexico. They formed a circle around a bonfire, and as they sang Amazing Grace, they began throwing books into the flames. Harry Potter novels, dozens of them, curled and blackened in the heat. The pastor called them a masterpiece of satanic deception. He told his congregation that these books were teaching children how to become witches and warlocks, how to worship the devil himself. None of them, by their own admission, had actually read the books they were burning. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger, a wave of fear and anger that swept through conservative and religious communities across America. The books that had captured the imaginations of millions of children were being labeled as dangerous, as gateways to the occult, as threats to the souls of young readers. Parents stood up at school board meetings demanding the books be removed. Librarians faced formal complaints, written requests to ban the series from their shelves. Churches organized protests. Some communities succeeded in getting the books pulled from schools and libraries, at least temporarily. The numbers tell their own story. Between 2000 and 2009, Harry Potter sat at the very top of the American Library Association's list of most challenged books. The series faced thousands of formal attempts to have it removed from schools and public libraries. These weren't just angry phone calls or casual complaints. These were official challenges, documented requests with signatures and legal language, all seeking to protect children from what critics saw as evil incarnate bound in colorful covers. The reasons given were remarkably consistent. Parents and religious leaders claimed the books glorified witchcraft and promoted the occult. They said the stories contained tones of death, hate, and sheer evil. They worried the books would lead children to rebellion, to hatred, to confusion about right and wrong. Some believed the magic in these pages would literally lure kids into practicing real witchcraft, that children would read about wands and spells and then seek out actual dark arts. The fear was genuine, the panic very real. Book burnings happened in other places too. In Pennsylvania, church congregations held similar ceremonies, feeding Harry Potter books to flames alongside other materials they deemed offensive. The symbolism was impossible to miss. This was the same act that had marked some of the darkest moments in human history, now being performed in modern America over a children's fantasy series. People who participated often spoke of purification, of protecting their communities, of standing up against forces they believed were corrupting youth. The Backlash revealed something profound about cultural anxiety. Here was a series about an orphaned boy who discovers he has magical powers, who attends a school where he learns spells and fights against an evil wizard bent on domination. To millions of readers, it was a story about friendship, bravery, and choosing good over evil. But to its critics, every spell cast on the page was an instruction manual. Every mention of magic was recruitment propaganda. The flying broomsticks, the talking portraits, the house elves and giants, all of it was seen not as imagination, but as indoctrination. What made this moral panic particularly intense was timing. The first book arrived in American bookstores in the late 90s, and by the early 2000s, Potter Mania had taken hold. The series was everywhere. Kids weren't just reading these books, they were dressing up as characters, attending midnight release parties, forming fan clubs, spending hours discussing theories and predictions. The cultural footprint was enormous, which meant the perceived threat felt equally massive to those who opposed it. Some critics pointed to specific elements that troubled them. The increasingly dark tone of later books, with torture, murder, and psychological manipulation, seemed inappropriate for young readers. Others focused on the lack of clear religious guidance in the stories, the absence of prayer or divine intervention. Still others worried about the moral ambiguity, the way characters who seemed good could do questionable things, the way even villains sometimes showed humanity. Religious leaders split on the issue. Some defended the books, arguing that they actually promoted Christian values like love, loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. They pointed out that the series showed clear consequences for choices, that evil was portrayed as evil and goodness ultimately triumphed. After the final book was published, Rowling herself confirmed she had intentionally woven Christian themes throughout, particularly the idea that love could conquer death. But these defenses did little to sway the series' most vocal opponents. The author found herself in an impossible position. She hadn't set out to corrupt anyone or promote any occult practice. She identified as Christian and later explained that she absolutely did not write these books to encourage children into witchcraft. She spoke about how the series was fundamentally about the power of love, about courage in the face of darkness, about choosing to do right even when it's difficult. But these explanations couldn't reach everyone, especially those who had already decided the books were dangerous without reading them. Librarians became unexpected soldiers in this conflict. They received complaints, faced pressure from community members, dealt with organized campaigns to remove the books. Some held firm, keeping Harry Potter on their shelves and organizing displays to support the series. When that church in New Mexico burned books, the local public library responded by keeping up its Harry Potter display, making a quiet statement about intellectual freedom. These librarians understood something crucial. Once you start removing books because some people find them objectionable, where do you stop? Who gets to decide what's too dangerous to read? The controversy revealed a deeper divide in how people understood childhood, imagination, and the role of literature. For Potter's defenders, fiction was a safe space to explore complex themes, to experience danger and darkness, and triumph from the security of a reading chair. The magic wasn't real, so it couldn't be dangerous. It was metaphor, symbol, a way to talk about real-world issues like prejudice, authoritarianism, and moral choice. But for critics, the line between fantasy and reality seemed dangerously thin. If children read about magic, they might seek it out. If books made evil seem exciting, kids might be drawn toward it. This wasn't really about Harry Potter at all. It was about control and change, about who gets to shape young minds and what values should guide them. It was about communities watching their children devour these books, watching Potter become a bigger influence than parents or pastors, and feeling frightened by that loss of authority. The books had become a cultural phenomenon, so powerful that opposing them felt necessary, like standing against a tide that threatened to sweep away everything familiar. The satanic panic around Harry Potter eventually faded, though challenges to the books continued sporadically for years. The series remained available in most places, read by generations of children who didn't become witches or devil worshippers. They just became readers, fans, people who carried these stories with them into adulthood. But the intensity of that early backlash, those fires in New Mexico and Pennsylvania, those thousands of formal complaints, they revealed something important about how deeply fiction can unsettle us, how powerfully stories can threaten those who fear change. The boy who lived had real-world enemies, and their battle was never really about magic at all. When the first book appeared on shelves, nobody could have predicted what was coming. Over 500 million copies sold worldwide, translated into 80 languages. Think about that for a moment. 500 million books. That's more than one for every 15 people on the planet. The numbers alone tell you something unprecedented happened here, something that went far beyond ordinary publishing success. The films pulled in roughly $7.7 billion at the global box office. But that's just the beginning of the money trail. There's the merchandise empire, the theme parks, the studio tours. Walk into any shopping mall anywhere in the world, and you'll find Harry Potter wands, scarves, replica glasses. The franchise didn't just sell books and tickets, it sold an entire world people wanted to inhabit. The woman behind it all started from rock bottom, a single mother on welfare, battling depression after her marriage fell apart. Before Harry Potter made her the wealthiest author in history, Rowling was scraping by, writing in coffee shops because her flat was too cold to work in. Publishers rejected her manuscript repeatedly. The story of how she went from that to this becomes part of the mythology itself, proof that magic can happen in the real world too. The publication date matters, 1997. The world was shifting into something new. The internet existed, but hadn't yet swallowed everything. Kids still read physical books, still waited for things instead of streaming them instantly. Harry Potter arrived at exactly the right moment, just before digital culture would change how stories spread, but early enough to ride that wave when it came. What happened next wasn't just about good marketing or movie tie-ins. Something deeper was going on. Midnight release parties became cultural events. Bookstores stayed open past closing time. Parents and children lined up together, sometimes in costume, waiting for the next installment. People took sick days from work to finish reading. Schools reported kids bringing 700-page novels to class and actually getting through them. The fan ecosystem that grew around the series became its own phenomenon. Online communities exploded. Archive of Our Own, one of the largest fanfiction repositories, now hosts over 400,000 Harry Potter stories written by fans. That's not counting the thousands more on other platforms. People weren't just reading these books, they were rewriting them, extending them, making them their own. The line between consumer and creator blurred completely. Then came the physical spaces. The Warner Bros. Studio tour in London turned the actual film sets into a pilgrimage site. Millions of visitors walk through those halls every year, seeing the Great Hall, Diagon Alley, the Forbidden Forest. Universal theme parks built entire lands dedicated to Hogwarts. You can drink butterbeer there. You can buy a wand that supposedly chooses you. The imaginary became concrete, walkable, purchasable. Role-playing games and societies formed on college campuses. People sorted themselves into houses: Gryffindor, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and meant it. These weren't just casual preferences, they became identities. Dating profiles listed house affiliations. Job interviews somehow worked them into conversation. A fictional sorting ceremony from a children's book became a legitimate form of self-definition. Who were these people consuming all this? Primarily millennials, that generation born between the early 80s and mid-90s. They grew up alongside Harry. When the first book came out, they were around his age, 11, 12, 13. As the series progressed over a decade, they aged with him. By the time the final book arrived, both Harry and his readers were approaching adulthood, dealing with similar questions about identity, mortality, purpose. That synchronization created something unusual. Most children's series get outgrown. Kids move on to other things as they age. But Harry Potter's readers didn't leave. The books matured with them, got darker, more complex, more willing to deal with death and loss and ambiguity. The series gave its audience permission to stay invested, to not abandon something just because it started as children's literature. For many of these readers, the books provided more than entertainment. They offered escape during difficult childhoods. They modeled friendship during lonely adolescent years. They presented moral frameworks for thinking about good and evil, loyalty and betrayal, courage and fear. Surveys show that 60% of millennials who read the series as children have reread it as adults. They return to these stories the way previous generations returned to fairy tales or religious texts, looking for something foundational. That generation is now in charge of things. Millennials who grew up with Harry Potter are running tech companies, writing legislation, teaching in universities, creating new art. The values embedded in those books, the importance of standing up to authority, the dangers of prejudice, the power of ordinary people working together, filtered into their worldviews. Whether consciously or not, the series shaped how an entire generation thinks about power, justice, community. The cultural footprint extended beyond English-speaking countries. The books translated well, carrying their themes across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Kids in Japan, Brazil, India, Russia all found something that resonated. The specifics were British: boarding schools, strict class systems, tea, and trunks. But the underlying story about an outsider finding where he belongs turned out to be universal. Critics dismissed it as a fad. They said the writing was serviceable at best, derivative at worst. They pointed out the borrowed mythology, the familiar plot structures. They questioned whether anything this popular could possibly be good. But those criticisms missed what was actually happening. People weren't just reading a well-crafted story. They were joining something, becoming part of a community that stretched across continents and generations. The merchandising machine that grew around Harry Potter would have been impossible without that emotional investment. Nobody buys a $30 replica wand unless they genuinely care about the story behind it. The commercial success followed from the genuine connection millions of people felt to these characters and this world. The franchise didn't manufacture loyalty. It earned it, then capitalized on it. Looking back now, Harry Potter's rise seems almost inevitable. Of course these books would become the best-selling series in history. Of course they'd spawn billion-dollar film franchises and theme parks. But it wasn't obvious at the time. Plenty of beloved books never break through to mass culture. Plenty of movie adaptations fail. Something about this particular story, at this particular moment, created a perfect storm of cultural resonance that nobody fully predicted and nobody has quite replicated since. I remember the first time I held one of those books. It was summer, probably around 2002. Someone handed me a copy of the first one, told me I had to read it. I was skeptical at first. A story about a boy wizard? It sounded like something for kids much younger than me. But I started reading anyway, and something strange happened. Hours disappeared. Then, days. I called in sick to things I shouldn't have missed. I stayed up past any reasonable hour. The world outside that story stopped mattering. That experience wasn't unique to me. Talk to anyone from that generation and you'll hear similar confessions. The books became obsessions. People skipped school, ignored responsibilities, locked themselves away until they finished whatever volume they were on. It wasn't just entertainment. It felt like something more necessary than that, like oxygen or sleep. What made it hit so hard? Partly, it was the timing. These books caught people at vulnerable ages, when you're figuring out who you are and where you fit. Harry Potter was an orphan who didn't belong anywhere, who lived in a cupboard under the stairs, who got treated like he was worthless. Then suddenly, he discovered he was special, that there was an entire world where he mattered, where he had friends and purpose and power. If you've ever felt like an outsider, that story lands differently. The reading experience itself created intimacy. You spent hundreds of pages inside Harry's head, experiencing his thoughts, his fears, his small victories, and devastating losses. The books didn't rush through plot points. They lingered on details. What it felt like to taste chocolate after encountering a Dementor. the warmth of the Weasley family kitchen, the quiet devastation of losing someone you loved. That kind of immersion builds connection. Now those readers are in their 30s and 40s, the millennials who grew up with these stories. Research shows the series influenced how they view leadership and moral development. They're running companies, writing policies, teaching the next generation. The values embedded in those books filtered into how they think about the world. Some of them went into helping professions: psychology, social work, teaching. They talk about how Hermione's fierce intelligence and loyalty showed them that being smart and kind weren't contradictory traits. How Harry's willingness to sacrifice himself taught them something about courage. How Dumbledore's flaws revealed that good people can make terrible mistakes and still be worth following. These weren't abstract lessons. They shaped real choices about what kind of work felt meaningful. The books arrived at a moment when many young people were dealing with difficult home situations, mental health struggles, social isolation. Harry provided a template for survival. He endured abuse from the Dursleys and kept going. He faced monsters, literal and metaphorical, and found ways to fight back. He built a chosen family when his biological one failed him. For readers going through their own darkness, those patterns mattered. The rereading statistics tell their own story. Surveys show significant numbers of people who read the series as children return to it as adults. They're not just nostalgic. They're looking for something these books still provide. Comfort, maybe, or perspective, or just the chance to remember who they were when they first encountered these stories, before life got more complicated. What's striking is how many of these readers don't treat their connection to Harry Potter as something childish to outgrow. They integrate it into their adult identities. They get tattoos of quotes from the books. They name their children after characters. They organize their friend groups around which Hogwarts house everyone belongs to. The series becomes part of their personal mythology, the stories they tell themselves about who they are. This wasn't just passive consumption. The generation that grew up with Harry Potter became creators themselves. They wrote hundreds of thousands of fan stories, reimagining the characters and world. They formed online communities where they debated interpretation, shared theories, built friendships with strangers across continents. The line between reader and writer blurred. The books became conversation starters, frameworks for connection. In professional settings, people found ways to reference the series, using it as shorthand for complex ideas. Describing a colleague as a real Hermione communicated volumes about intelligence, loyalty, and occasional self-righteousness. Warning about Umbridge-like bureaucracy captured a specific kind of institutional evil better than a paragraph of explanation could. The books created a shared language. Some critics argue this generation relies too heavily on children's literature for their worldview. They point out that reducing politics to good guys versus bad guys, Dumbledore's army versus Death Eaters, oversimplifies reality's messy complications. That's probably fair. But stories shape us whether we want them to or not. The myths we grow up with become the lens through which we see everything else. The impact shows up in unexpected places. Studies examined how growing up with these books influenced millennial perspectives on leadership, showing they absorbed lessons about moral development and decision-making from watching Harry navigate impossible choices. They learned about institutional corruption from the Ministry of Magic. They saw how prejudice operates from the treatment of house elves and Muggleborns. They witnessed what happens when good people stay silent in the face of rising authoritarianism. Those lessons became personal. When readers encountered discrimination or injustice in their own lives, they had a framework for understanding it. When they saw powerful institutions protecting themselves instead of vulnerable people, they recognized the pattern from the books. The stories didn't just entertain, they educated, even when that wasn't the explicit goal. The solace these books provided shouldn't be underestimated either. Growing up is hard. Adolescence brings identity crises, social anxieties, the crushing realization that the world is more complicated and cruel than you understood as a child. Having a story that acknowledged that darkness while insisting that love and friendship and courage matter anyway, that meant something. It still means something to the adults those readers became. There's a reason so many of them return to these books during difficult times. Breakups, job losses, family crises, global pandemics. When everything feels uncertain, they go back to Hogwarts. They know how the story ends. They know Harry survives. They know good triumphs, even at terrible cost. Sometimes you need that kind of certainty, even if it only exists in fiction. The confession at the heart of this is simple. An entire generation let themselves be shaped by a children's book series. They let it influence their values, their career choices, their understanding of good and evil. They carry it with them still, these stories about a boy wizard and his friends. And they're not ashamed of that. If anything, they're grateful. The books gave them something to hold on to when they needed it most. That's not nothing. That might be everything. Every great story borrows from the ones that came before. Harry Potter isn't an exception to this rule. It's built on a foundation of fairy tales and folklore that reaches back centuries, maybe millennia. The archetypes that drive the series, the patterns that shape the characters, they're as old as storytelling itself. And that's exactly why they work. Start with Harry himself. He's an orphan, living under the stairs in his aunt and uncle's house, treated like a servant, forced to wear hand-me-down clothes that don't fit, denied even basic kindness. Sound familiar? It should. This is Cinderella, in different clothes. The persecuted hero, unrecognized and undervalued, who discovers they're actually destined for something extraordinary. It's one of the oldest patterns in human storytelling, showing up in cultures across the world. The child who suffers unjust oppression but ultimately receives triumphant reward. Cinderella works because it speaks to something universal. We've all felt overlooked, underestimated, trapped in circumstances we didn't choose. The fantasy of discovering you're actually special, that you have hidden worth that will one day be recognized, it resonates across generations. Harry gets his letter from Hogwarts the same way Cinderella gets her fairy godmother. Suddenly, the world transforms. The magic was there all along, waiting to be revealed. But Harry isn't just Cinderella. He's also the classic hero's journey protagonist, the chosen one, the boy with the lightning bolt scar who survived when he should have died. This is mythology's favorite pattern, the special child marked by fate. It shows up in King Arthur, in Moses, in countless heroes across cultures. The orphan who doesn't know their true significance until the moment arrives. The weight of destiny pressing down on shoulders too young to fully understand what they're carrying. Then there's the supporting cast, each one slotting neatly into archetypal roles that readers recognize instinctively. Ron is the loyal companion, the best friend who stands beside the hero even when it's dangerous, even when it's thankless. He's Sam to Harry's Frodo, Watson to his Holmes. Hermione is another kind of companion, the wise helper who knows what the hero needs to hear even when they don't want to hear it. She's got the knowledge that saves them, the quick thinking that fills in the gaps. Together, they form the trinity that appears in stories everywhere. Three friends united against the darkness. And then there's Dumbledore, the wise old mentor with the long beard and the twinkling eyes, speaking in riddles and half-truths, guiding the hero without quite giving away all the answers. He's Merlin teaching the young Arthur. He's Gandalf leading Frodo. He's every sage who ever appeared in a fairy tale to set the protagonist on their path. The archetype is so deeply embedded in storytelling that we barely notice it anymore. We just accept that, of course, there's a wise old man, Of course he knows more than he's saying. Of course he'll be there when needed most. What Dumbledore represents is the idea that wisdom comes with age, that there are guides who can help us navigate the darkness even if they can't walk the path for us. He's flawed, as later books reveal, but that actually makes the archetype more powerful. He's not the perfect, all-knowing mentor. He's made mistakes. He carries regrets. But he's still trying to do right, still attempting to prepare Harry for what's coming. That complexity takes a fairy tale figure and makes him human. Rowling didn't just pull from English fairy tales and modern fantasy. She reached further back, into the myths and legends of ancient civilizations. Take Fluffy, the three-headed dog guarding the trapdoor in the first book. That's Cerberus, the guardian of the Greek underworld, barely disguised. In mythology, Cerberus kept the dead from escaping Hades. In Harry Potter, Fluffy guards the Philosopher's Stone, keeping it safe from those who would steal it. The parallel goes deeper. In Greek myth, Orpheus put Cerberus to sleep with music from his lyre, allowing him to enter the underworld to retrieve his dead wife. In Harry Potter, Fluffy falls asleep to music too. Hagrid mentions it casually, almost as an aside, but it's a direct echo of the ancient story. When Harry and his friends need to get past Fluffy, they use a flute. The beast that seems invincible, that appears designed to stop anyone from passing, has this one weakness. Music soothes the savage beast, just like it did thousands of years ago in Greek storytelling. These aren't accidents. Rowling studied classics, knew the old stories, and wove them throughout her books. Sometimes the references are obvious, sometimes subtle, but they're always there, adding layers of meaning for readers who recognize them. And for those who don't, the archetypal patterns still work on a deeper level. The brain recognizes these shapes even when the conscious mind doesn't name them. That's the power of archetypes. They're shortcuts to meaning. When we see the orphan hero, we know immediately what kind of story we're in. When the wise mentor appears, we understand their role without needing it explained. These patterns have been tested over centuries of storytelling. They work because they reflect something true about human experience, about the challenges we face and the ways we grow. Harry's journey from ordinary to extraordinary, from powerless to powerful, mirrors the transformation that every person undergoes as they grow up. We all start small and scared. We all face challenges that seem too big for us. We all need friends, need mentors, need to discover our own hidden strengths. The fairy tale framework allows Rowling to explore these universal experiences through metaphor and magic. The series begins firmly in fairy tale territory. The first book especially feels like a classic children's story. There's wonder around every corner. The magic is bright and colorful. The dangers, while real, are manageable. Good and evil are clearly defined. Voldemort is the dark wizard, the monster in the shadows. Dumbledore is the good wizard, the protector. Harry and his friends are the innocent children caught between them. But even in that first book, Rowling starts to complicate the archetypes. Professor Snape seems like the villain, acts like the villain, but turns out to be protecting Harry. Professor Quirrell seems nervous and harmless, but he's the one actually serving Voldemort. The wise mentor, Dumbledore, admits he makes mistakes. The heroes succeed not because they're the strongest or the smartest, but because they work together and choose to do right even when it's hard. This is where Harry Potter transcends simple fairy tale and becomes something richer. It uses the archetypal foundations to hook young readers, gives them familiar patterns to hold on to. But then it gradually adds complexity, shades of gray, moral ambiguity. The loyal sidekick Ron gets jealous and abandons his friends. The wise mentor Dumbledore turns out to have a dark past and questionable methods. The chosen hero Harry discovers he carries a piece of the villain's soul inside him. These complications don't destroy the archetypes, they deepen them. They show that real people are messier than fairy tale characters, that real morality is harder than just choosing good over evil. The series grows up alongside its readers, taking them from simple stories about heroes and villains to more nuanced explorations of what it means to be brave, to be good, to be human. The fairy tale foundation remains throughout. Harry is always the orphaned hero, always marked by destiny, always facing impossible odds. But he's also a real kid, dealing with homework and friendship drama and complicated feelings about the adults in his life. The magic is real, but so is the mundane world that continues alongside it. The archetypes provide the structure, the familiar shapes that make the story feel timeless and universal. But the details, the specific choices Rowling makes about how these archetypes behave and evolve, that's what makes the series feel fresh and alive. In the end, that's why these books connected with so many readers. They gave us the comfort of the old stories, the patterns we've loved for generations. The orphan who becomes special, the loyal friends who stand together, the wise mentor who guides from the shadows, the great evil that must be defeated. But they also gave us something new, something that felt relevant to our specific moment in time. The fairy tale foundation made us feel safe enough to explore the harder truths lurking underneath. When you dig a little deeper into the literary DNA of the Harry Potter series, you can see these powerful connections to classic English literature. It's not just a standalone fantasy, it's steeped in tradition. A great example of this is J.K. Rowling's obvious admiration for Charles Dickens. Rowling herself has openly admitted her love for Dickens, and you can see his influence not only in the cast of eccentrics at Hogwarts, but also in the central moral journey of the story. The parallels with Dickens's A Christmas Carol are particularly striking. That novella centers on Ebenezer Scrooge, a man whose heart has calcified over the years, only to be forced by supernatural forces to confront his past, present, and future until he achieves a profound, life-altering redemption. Harry's journey follows a similar spiritual arc, a kind of hardening through constant adversity, leading toward a final, necessary sacrifice. Harry is an orphan, just like many of Dickens's protagonists, thrust into a harsh world, his first decade spent in a cupboard under the stairs with the Dursleys, which is pure Dickensian neglect. He is the classic underdog, plucked from poverty and obscurity. That first decade of darkness makes his first Christmas at Hogwarts feel like a true miracle, a moment of profound hope. It's the first time he receives real, thoughtful gifts, not just a 50-pence piece or an old sock, but a hand-knitted Weasley sweater and, most crucially, the invisibility cloak, a direct connection to the family he lost. This Christmas isn't just a seasonal break, it's the symbolic moment when Harry is truly welcomed into his chosen family, the Weasleys and Hogwarts itself. It's a moment of light that reaffirms the central theme of love and belonging against the coldness of his life with the Dursleys. Harry's first proper Christmas dinner in the Great Hall, surrounded by friends, food, and genuine joy, is literally a new beginning for his soul. It's the moment the magic of the world becomes more than just spectacle, it becomes home. But the Dickinsonian influence also appears in the story's embrace of moral ambiguity. Dickens was brilliant at painting characters who weren't simply black or white, but a complex mix of good intentions and human failings. Rowling does the same thing, steering the story away from the simple, clear-cut morality of traditional fairy tales and into the murky shades of gray that define real life. No character embodies this moral complexity more than Severus Snape. For nearly the entire series, he is positioned as a classic villain, cruel, spiteful, and an obsessive bully to Harry. Yet the final revelations flip the entire narrative on its head. We learn that his decades of seemingly villainous service to Albus Dumbledore were in fact driven by a deep, enduring, and ultimately tragic love for Harry's mother, Lily Potter. This is redemption on a massive scale, a total atonement for his past life as a Death Eater. But it's not a clean redemption. He remains a deeply flawed, unpleasant person who continues to abuse a child, Harry, right up until the end. Snape's motives were intensely personal. Protection of Lily's son was his primary, single-minded objective, making his heroics feel less like selfless moral goodness and more like a complicated, painful form of penance. He dies before he can ever truly be forgiven by Harry or his peers, a sacrifice made in secret that only Dumbledore ever fully understood. This final revelation forces the reader to completely reevaluate everything they thought they knew about the man, and about the nature of good and evil itself. Was he a hero? A villain? He was both, making him perhaps the most complex and compelling character in the series. This willingness to give a primary antagonist a path toward redemption, however thorny, or to show a hero like Harry struggling with moments of rage and moral lapse, elevates the story. It doesn't just teach young readers that there is good and evil in the world, but that there are choices, and that a person's life is defined not by their intentions or their status, but by the accumulation of those choices, good and bad. It's a far more mature and resonant message than a simple fairy tale, and it's a direct literary lineage traceable to the great novelists of the past, who understood that the heart of drama lies in the battle between a man's better and worse natures. It's easy to think of Harry Potter as a purely modern invention, a story that sprang fully formed from J.K. Rowling's brilliant mind, but the truth is that the narrative backbone of the entire series is ancient. It's built on a foundation of classical mythology, particularly the grand, sweeping tragedies and epic journeys found in Greek and Roman lore. Once you start looking, these echoes of antiquity are everywhere, underpinning the biggest emotional moments and the deepest themes in the wizarding world. Take, for instance, a sequence that's both terrifying and deeply sorrowful: Harry's desperate descent into that frozen underground lake to retrieve one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. It's a moment that feels immediately familiar to anyone who's read a myth about the underworld. The icy, dark waters and the monstrous Inferi who try to drag him down are straight out of the Greek tradition of the river Styx, the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead. It's the ultimate spiritual test, forcing Harry to confront death itself to fulfill his destiny. In the myths, the dead must cross the Styx, often guided by the ferryman Charon. Harry's journey is his own version of that crossing, a symbolic death and rebirth that hardens him for the battles to come. The most heart-wrenching moment in the series' middle section, the return of Voldemort, is also a direct callback to one of the most foundational epic poems in human history, Homer's Iliad. When Harry manages to escape the graveyard, he doesn't just run. He uses the portkey to bring back the body of his friend, Cedric Diggory. This act of profound protective duty, of refusing to abandon the fallen to the enemy, directly mirrors the fierce, soul-deep grief of the Greek hero Achilles. In the Iliad, after his closest friend Patroclus is killed by the Trojan hero Hector, Achilles goes on a destructive, avenging rampage. But a huge part of his character is his intense focus on honoring the dead. He drags Hector's body, not as disrespect, but as an act of ritualized vengeance and a necessary step in the grieving process. Harry, though only a boy, echoes this when he refuses to let go of Cedric, carrying his friend's corpse back to the light. It's an act that cements his identity not just as a hero, but as a man burdened by real, tragic loss. The human impact is immediate. It transforms the reader's understanding of Harry's pain from a magical fight into a visceral, ancient sorrow. Even the fundamental relationship between Harry and Voldemort is rooted in the complex, fateful lineage found in myths. It's revealed later that the two are, in fact, distant relatives. They both descend from the Peverell brothers, who legend says received the 3 Deathly Hallows. This blood tie, this shared, fated heritage, is a classic trope in Greek tragedy. Think of families in those myths where an inescapable curse or fate binds generations together, forcing kin to fight kin, like the doomed House of Atreus, for example. Harry and Voldemort aren't just adversaries, they are two sides of a magical, fated coin. Their ultimate confrontation isn't just about good versus evil, but about free will versus an ancient, inescapable destiny. Harry has to choose to break the cycle of violence and death that his bloodline and Voldemort's actions has laid out for him. And what of Harry's own soul? The very concept of him containing a part of Voldemort's soul, a piece of his essence, gives his emotional struggle an almost mythical weight. It brings to mind the divided, suffering soul of Heracles, or Hercules in the Roman tradition. Heracles, after his heroic labors, was granted godhood, but myth suggests that while his immortal self feasts with the gods, his ghostly, mortal self, his eidolon, wanders the underworld, still bearing the scars and burdens of his earthly life. Harry is alive, but a part of him, the Horcrux, is trapped, tormented, and desperately trying to escape. This divided existence, the hero walking with a piece of his worst enemy inside him, is a potent metaphor for any deep internal emotional struggle. It externalizes the feeling that a piece of you is broken, corrupted, or not fully your own. It takes the emotional turmoil of a young person feeling different or alienated and elevates it to the level of mythic suffering. The genius of Rowling's storytelling is that she doesn't just copy these myths, she weaves them seamlessly into a modern narrative about a boy wizard. By tapping into these universal archetypes and foundational stories, she ensures that the themes of sacrifice, love, loss, and the eternal struggle against a terrible fate resonate with an immediacy that goes far beyond a simple children's book. It grounds the magic in a profound human truth that has been told and retold for thousands of years. The struggles of Harry Potter are, at their core, the struggles of humanity in the face of destiny, played out on a grand mythological stage. The wizarding world works because it is, quite literally, built on the echoes of antiquity. If the stories themselves are built on the foundations of ancient myth, the power that drives them, the magic, is built on the foundation of ancient language. When the characters in the wizarding world cast a spell, they aren't just saying random words, they're invoking the ghosts of Latin, Aramaic, and other forgotten tongues. This attention to linguistic detail is one of the key reasons the magic in Harry Potter feels so authentic and scholarly, yet still accessible. Rowling essentially created her own working dialect, which fans call Dog Latin. It's not strictly proper Latin, which would be too dry and complex for a children's book, but it takes actual Latin roots and combines them to form simple, direct canons. This makes the spells feel like a real academic subject that Hogwarts students would have to master. Look at the Patronus charm, Expecto Patronum. That's one of the most powerful and important spells in the entire series, and its meaning is perfectly encapsulated in its Latin roots. Expecto means I await, or I look out for, and patronum is a form of the word patronus, meaning protector or guardian. So when Harry yells the spell, he is literally commanding, I await a protector. The spell then manifests as his spirit animal, the stag, an animal that symbolizes his father and his deepest, purest memories of love and sacrifice. The language itself adds a profound layer to the emotional weight of the spell. It's a literal linguistic expression of courage and hope. The opposite end of the spectrum, the unforgivable curses, are also rooted in deep historical language, but with a darker, ironic twist. The killing curse, Avada Kedavra, is the most infamous phrase in the series. It's chilling because it sounds like a sudden, foreign word, but its roots are surprisingly familiar and unsettling. Rowling has confirmed that it derives from the Aramaic phrase Abada Kedavra, which translates roughly to disappear like this word, or perish as I speak. But what's truly fascinating is that Aramaic is the language from which we also get the famous stage magician's word abracadabra. For millennia, abracadabra was as as a healing charm, an incantation whispered to make sickness, or the word itself, vanish. Rowling essentially took a word traditionally meant to heal and protect and twisted its ancient power into the ultimate curse of death. It's an act of profound linguistic irony that makes the curse feel not just evil, but a corruption of a sacred, old power. This method of using real language creates a cultural fusion that elevates the entire world. Lumos, the light charm, is simple. The Latin root lumen means light. Sectum sempra, the dark spell created by Snape, breaks down to sectum, cut or severed, and sempra, always. It is, quite plainly, always cutting. By blending these ancient languages, Rowling achieves a powerful effect. She makes the fantastical world of magic feel scholarly, authentic, and historically deep. It's not just nonsense words pulled from thin air. It's a systematic, learned language that feels like it has been taught and passed down in secretive libraries for centuries. This makes the reader believe in the complexity of the magic, not just the spectacle of it. For young readers, this linguistic magic is a subtle education. It transforms the act of reading a fantasy book into an encounter with classical civilization. It plants these Latin and Aramaic roots firmly in their minds, making the magic feel real because the words themselves are real. It's an ingenious way to make a vast, imagined world feel anchored to the real history and language of our own. It's tempting to think of the Harry Potter series solely as children's literature or a modern fantasy saga, but to do so would be to miss the deeper currents running through the narrative. J.K. Rowling herself has often pointed to her literary influences, and among the most significant, a true foundational bedrock, is William Shakespeare. It elevates the material from a simple story about magic to a dramatic epic, a tragedy with moments of high comedy and devastating prophecy. Rowling has been open about her love for the bard, and there is one play in particular that casts a long shadow over Harry's world: Macbeth. The core tragedy of Macbeth is that it's a story of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The three witches tell Macbeth he'll be king, and his ambition and subsequent fear, not fate alone, drive him to murder the current king and ultimately lead to his own downfall. This is almost exactly the dark mechanism that drives Voldemort. The prophecy Trelawney gives in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix is chillingly similar. It's about a boy born at the end of July who will be the only one able to vanquish the Dark Lord. It's a classic setup, but the crucial part is that Voldemort chooses to act on the prophecy. He decides that the boy is Harry Potter, not Neville Longbottom, and by trying to kill the infant Harry, he accidentally gives him the very power that will defeat him: Lily Potter's sacrificial love. Voldemort's fear and arrogance, his fatal flaw, make him believe he can outrun the words of the prophecy. In doing so, just like Macbeth, he signs his own death warrant. The Dark Lord brings about his own destruction by attempting to prevent it. It's a magnificent piece of dramatic irony straight out of the Shakespearean playbook. The Shakespearean echoes go beyond just the core plot mechanics. Take the sheer scale of the conflict. The battles, the betrayals, the secret meetings in dark corners. It has the scope of a history play, a royal succession drama played out with wands instead of swords. Ambition is a central theme, not just with Voldemort and his lust for immortality and power, but also in the subtle, destructive ambition of characters like Dolores Umbridge, whose thirst for control of the Ministry and Hogwarts is a terrifying miniature tyranny. This echoes the political maneuvering and moral compromises seen in plays like Richard III or Julius Caesar. Consider the quieter, almost poetic moments too. Petrification is a dramatic device used most notably in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets when the basilisk attacks. We see various students and, tragically, Hermione Granger, frozen solid, their eyes open but lifeless, like statues. This physical paralysis as a consequence of a magical curse is a startling visual, and it brings to mind the dramatic, often fantastical punishments in plays like The Winter's Tale. In that play, King Leontes' extreme jealousy leads to the presumed death of his wife, Hermione, who later appears as a statue, only to dramatically come back to life. While Hermione Granger's petrification is caused by a monster and is purely physical, the effect on the audience is the same. A moment of frozen, high-stakes drama, a breath held until the inevitable, joyful restoration. Rowling confirmed that the literary parallels are intentional, and they are what gives the series its dramatic weight. By basing her work on these enduring, high-stakes narratives of fear, power, and consequence, she is saying to the reader, without ever stating it explicitly, this is not just a book about a boy wizard. This is a universal story about human fallibility and the nature of tragedy. The inclusion of these grand theatrical themes elevates the series from simple children's entertainment to something that can sit comfortably alongside the great literary epics. It's what allows the series to mature as the characters and the readers do. We start with the whimsical wonder of magic, but by the end, we are wrestling with questions of mortality, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism, much like an audience at the Globe Theatre. It is the language of prophecy and the architecture of tragedy that makes the Harry Potter series feel both ancient and utterly new. When we first meet Harry Potter, he's an 11-year-old orphan, and the books feel exactly right for that age. Whimsical, full of wonder, and grounded in a classic fairy tale structure. Hogwarts is an enchanting castle, a safe haven where adventures involve solving puzzles and navigating a three-headed dog. The biggest threat is a ghost or a slightly grumpy teacher. But that world doesn't last. The series has to grow up, because Harry has to grow up. And that change in the main character is what drives one of the most remarkable genre evolutions in modern literature. As Harry matures from 11 to 17, the tone of the series deliberately and relentlessly shifts. By the time we get to Order of the Phoenix and beyond, we've moved past the fairy tale and into something much darker. It becomes a young adult epic, blending elements of dark horror, political thriller, and even romance. Rowling wasn't afraid to let the sunshine fade. The books become a direct mirror of the reader's journey through adolescence. Harry's early years are simple, focusing on external threats and immediate dangers. His later years, however, are dominated by internal struggles, which reflects the tumultuous mental state of a teenager. Consider the fifth book, The Order of the Phoenix. Harry is angry. He's sullen. He's lashing out. A perfect portrayal of a mid-adolescent struggling with trauma, isolation, and hormonal changes. He can't control his temper. His visions with Voldemort are becoming more frequent, and he feels completely misunderstood. This increased anxiety and emotional turbulence in the character and the subsequent psychological depth added to the narrative resonated powerfully with the millennial generation who were reading the books as they themselves entered those difficult teen years. The books went from being escapist fun to a form of emotional validation. The setting itself changes dramatically to reflect this maturation. Hogwarts stops being a purely magical place of wonder and transforms into a perilous battleground. The secrets are no longer about hidden rooms and enchanted chess sets. They're about death, betrayal, and soul-destroying magic. By the time they are hunting Horcruxes in the final books, the characters are on the run, isolated, paranoid, and facing real-world fatigue and depression. The stakes are no longer about losing the Quidditch Cup, they are about life and death on a global scale. This is where the horror elements truly surface. The books are full of imagery that would be totally out of place in the earlier installments. Characters being tortured, the psychological despair caused by the Dementors, which Rowling intentionally created as a metaphor for her own depression, and the sheer physical exhaustion and danger of wartime survival. This shift isn't just a stylistic choice. It reflects a deep understanding of resilience. The kids we meet are forced to grow up fast, to make adult decisions, and to accept loss. They face deaths, Cedric, Sirius, Dumbledore, and ultimately a host of others, that become harder, more visceral, and more permanent than anything in a typical fairy tale. In essence, Rowling pulled off a delicate, sustained balancing act. She kept the magic and the underlying themes of love and friendship, but she completely re-geared the tone and the genre over 7 books. She took her young characters and put them through the crucible of a world war, forcing them to shed their childhood innocence. It's what allowed the series to hold on to its original readers as they aged, providing a continuous narrative thread that matured right along with them, ensuring that the books remained deeply relevant from childhood well into young adulthood. You know, for all the talk about epic battles and dark magic, a lot of the emotional weight in the Harry Potter series actually comes down to the quiet, sometimes awkward, business of simply loving another person. Romance, even in a world with dragons and time-turners, is pretty subdued, often taking a back seat to the much bigger struggle against Voldemort. But when you look closely, it's those intimate connections that motivate and, frankly, save everyone. The most powerful and arguably most tragic example of this is Severus Snape. His entire complex arc, his ultimate redemption, is not driven by a desire to defeat the Dark Lord for the good of the world, but by the memory of a single girl, Lily Potter, Harry's mother. The deep, unrequited love he held for her, stretching all the way back to their childhood, becomes a shield. After her death, he dedicates his life to protecting her son, Harry, purely out of that enduring, powerful grief. It's a love story that's mostly told in fragments and flashbacks, but when the full truth is revealed, it retroactively changes how we see nearly every action Snape takes in the entire series. It turns him from a bitter bully into a tragic hero whose loyalty is absolute, his courage terrifyingly quiet. It's almost a medieval concept of courtly love, where the pursuit or memory of the beloved inspires heroic acts, but stripped bare and made real. This kind of sacrifice, where a lifetime of service is given for a love that will never be returned, even echoes grand old literary traditions. Think about Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. Dante's spiritual journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven is essentially driven by his intense, idealized love for Beatrice. She is his guide, his muse, and his motivator, representing the highest form of spiritual love that leads him to God. Snape's devotion to Lily is a dark mirror of that. It guides him through the shadows of the war, making him an agent of good despite his own inner darkness. His famous final word, always, when Dumbledore asks if he still loves Lily, has become one of the most iconic, gut-wrenching lines in modern literature, because it encapsulates that immense, unending power of love as a motivator amid loss. But what about the main character? The truth is, for Harry Potter himself, love is mostly about friendship and family, not romance. His primary emotional relationship is with Ron and Hermione, a trio built on unwavering loyalty that withstands political pressure, life-or-death crises, and even Ron's occasional jealousy. When romance does appear for Harry, it's remarkably understated. His relationship with Ginny Weasley is genuine, but it never takes center stage. There are no great, sweeping romantic pronouncements that define the story. The narrative emphasis is always on the mission, the fight, and the development of their individual careers and roles in the coming war. J.K. Rowling has said she made a conscious choice to sideline the traditional teen romance tropes. For the characters, especially as they enter the final, darkest books, their main priority is survival and defeating evil. They're constantly dealing with death, paranoia, and the very real threat of fascism. In that context, a prolonged, high-drama romantic subplot would have felt trivial or even inappropriate. Instead, the small, quiet moments, like Ron and Hermione finally holding hands or sharing a kiss amid the chaos of battle, carry 10 times the emotional weight because they are a momentary victory for normalcy and hope in a world falling apart. This minimalist approach to romance highlights the series' true themes: sacrifice and redemption. The love that wins is the self-sacrificial kind: Lily's decision to die for her son, Dumbledore's trust in Snape, or Ron's willingness to face his greatest fear in the Chamber of Secrets for Hermione. These acts illustrate that the true magic in the story isn't in the spells, but in the courage born out of a deep human connection. It's a powerful message, especially for the millions of young readers who grew up with the books, suggesting that it's not the grand, passionate affair that matters most, but the unwavering commitment you show to the people you care about, even when it costs you everything. It's about being driven by emotional depth rather than simply by physical attraction or fleeting infatuation. And that's what makes the love stories, though few and far between, so unforgettable. The world of Harry Potter is filled with actual magic: spells, potions, transfiguration. But the deepest, most compelling kind of magic happens inside the characters' heads. The series, especially as it matures, isn't just an adventure story. It's a psychological novel masquerading as a fantasy epic. J.K. Rowling really dug into the inner lives of her characters, giving us a complex look at mental health, trauma, and self-awareness. One of the most famous examples of this depth is the depiction of Dementors. These terrifying, hooded creatures, who literally suck the joy out of the air and force you to relive your worst memories, are essentially a perfect metaphor for clinical depression. Rowling herself has spoken openly about drawing on her own experiences with depression to create them. The emotional impact is immediate and devastating. When a Dementor is near, you're not just sad, you are completely drained of hope and happiness. The cure for this emotional assault is the Patronus charm, Expecto Patronum. To cast it successfully, a witch or wizard has to concentrate on a single, powerful, happy memory. It's an act of mind over matter, a refusal to surrender to despair, which is a surprisingly accurate, if simplified, description of managing real-world depression. You have to actively fight the darkness by summoning the light, using self-generated joy as a shield. The fact that Harry, who has suffered such profound trauma and loss, is one of the few students who can master this charm speaks volumes about his inner resilience. Harry's struggles are more than just fighting off dark creatures. They are deeply psychological. A huge part of his journey involves his mental connection to Voldemort. We see this in the classes he takes in Occlumency, the magical art of closing one's mind against outside intrusion. Harry constantly fails at this because of his greatest strength, his empathy. He is too open, too connected to the pain of others, and too eager to understand Voldemort's thoughts, even the twisted ones. His inability to shut down his feelings is what makes him a poor Occlumens, but it's also what makes him a better person than his enemy. His open mind is a vulnerability, but it's also the engine for his ultimate victory, rooted in his capacity to love. Beyond the mental health metaphors, the structure of the conflict often borrows heavily from the detective novel genre. Harry, Hermione, and Ron spend a significant amount of time investigating mysteries, from the identity of the person who opened the Chamber of Secrets to the truth behind the Half-Blood Prince. They gather clues, formulate theories, and often rely on logic and deduction more than magic. The rivalry between Harry and Voldemort is the ultimate version of this intellectual and psychological cat-and-mouse game, often paralleling the classic literary duel between Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty. Holmes and Moriarty represent two sides of genius, one for justice, one for chaos, and their fate is inextricably linked. Similarly, Harry and Voldemort are connected not just by the scar, but by a shared history, shared knowledge, and a shared capacity for great power, wielded in fundamentally different ways. The final hunt for the Horcruxes is less a grand battle and more a prolonged detective case, requiring them to put together fragmented pieces of history, memory, and obscure lore to solve the greatest crime in the wizarding world. For millennials who grew up reading these books, this blending of fantasy with sharp psychological and deductive reasoning resonated deeply. Many young readers found real-world solace in the metaphors. Surveys have shown that a significant percentage of young readers felt less alone and gained a better understanding of anxiety and depression through the Dementor Patronus allegory. The books not only gave them a vocabulary for talking about difficult emotions, but also illustrated a clear, magical path toward resilience and self-awareness, making the series far more than just a tale of wizards and wands. It was a guide to navigating the darkness within. It's easy to think of the wizarding world as just some fantastical, disconnected place. Tolkien's Middle-earth, for example, is entirely separate, a whole other history and creation. J.K. Rowling, though, did something different. She didn't create a completely isolated realm. She built a hidden world right on top of our own. It's grounded in our reality, in modern Britain, and that's a key part of its appeal. The magic isn't in a far-off dimension, it's just around the corner, behind a brick wall in London or a secret path near a fishing village. This concept of integration is vital. It's about a parallel universe that uses the same geography. When Harry takes the Hogwarts Express from King's Cross Station, that's a real, iconic London landmark. The Ministry of Magic is nestled underground in London, requiring a special telephone booth entrance. This choice wasn't accidental. It gave the fantasy an immediate, visceral feeling of possibility for the millions of readers who lived in or knew about Britain. It made the magic feel like a secret history rather than a pure invention. It's interesting to consider why Rowling chose Britain as the anchor for this fantasy. She was a single mother, drawing on the culture and society she knew best. She took elements of British society, its love of bureaucratic institutions, its eccentric personalities, its quaint village pubs, its strict boarding schools, and infused them with magic to create an authentic-feeling subculture. She drew inspiration from real-world locations, like the Victorian architecture of her hometown of Edinburgh, which lends itself to the secret alleyways and cobbled streets of Diagon Alley. This commitment to grounding the fantasy in a familiar cultural landscape is what allowed the world-building to feel so rich and tangible. It wasn't just a story about good versus evil. It was a story about good versus evil in our neighborhood, which dramatically raises the stakes. This approach of integrating the magical and the mundane provides a crucial element of the series: wish fulfillment. It offers a way to escape the tediousness of the real world without actually having to leave it. The wizarding world isn't some distant dream you can never touch. It's a hidden compartment within your existing life. That element of foresight, of predicting or perhaps even inspiring real-world technological and cultural shifts, is what elevates the Harry Potter series beyond simple children's literature into a document that, in a bizarre way, captures the zeitgeist of the coming millennium. The books presented a fascinating question to a generation. What if the magic isn't gone? What if it's just really, really good at hiding? It encouraged a way of looking at the world with a sense of wonder and skepticism at the same time. Wonder at the possibilities and skepticism about what the official story might be missing. It was a secret, whispered promise to a generation. There's more to this world than meets the eye. When you look closely at the political history of the wizarding world, especially the big bloody conflicts, you can't help but see the unsettling echoes of our own 20th century history. It all comes back to Grindelwald, the dark wizard who rose to power decades before Voldemort. Grindelwald's ambitions and ideology drew a striking parallel to the rise of fascism and the dark shadow of World War II. His motto was, "For the greater good," a phrase that sounds noble on the surface, but was used to justify a deeply disturbing, elitist agenda. Grindelwald wasn't just after power. He was a revolutionary seeking to overthrow the established statute of secrecy, arguing that wizards, as inherently superior beings, should rule over non-magical people, or muggles, for their own benefit. This wasn't just a grab for power. It was an ideology of magical supremacy. It preached that wizards were a master race, entitled to dominate others. This mirrors the eugenics and racial purity doctrines espoused by the Nazis in Germany. Grindelwald's movement gained traction, causing widespread terror and conflict throughout the 1920s and 30s in Europe, a timeline that deliberately overlaps with the real-world ascent of totalitarian regimes. The Wizarding War against Grindelwald culminated in a legendary duel between him and Albus Dumbledore in 1945. This is no minor detail. The year 1945 is the precise historical marker for the end of World War II in the Muggle world. By aligning the defeat of the most dangerous Dark Lord of the time with the defeat of Adolf Hitler and the Axis powers, Rowling clearly establishes an allegorical link. Grindelwald's tyranny was the wizarding world's devastating global conflict. After his defeat, Grindelwald was imprisoned in his own custom-built prison, Nurmengard, for the rest of his long life. The imagery of a defeated, major war criminal locked away in isolation resonates with the fate of high-ranking Nazi officials. Consider the real-world comparison to Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and minister of armaments. Speer was tried at the Nuremberg trials and served 20 years in Spandau prison. Like Grindelwald, who eventually showed a degree of repentance and remorse, Speer offered a form of apology for his part in the atrocities. In the final Harry Potter book, when Voldemort tracks down Grindelwald at Nurmengard, Grindelwald chooses to lie and defy him, protecting the location of the Elder Wand. This final act of defiance and repentance, decades after his crimes, suggests a character grappling with the immense human costs of his ambition. It offers a subtle, complex reflection on how even those who commit monstrous acts might, in the very end, acknowledge the evil they perpetrated. Grindelwald's imprisonment and eventual reflection stand as a narrative echo of the post-war reckoning, the attempt to deal with the moral and ethical fallout of a truly dark period. These parallels serve a deeper purpose than just historical referencing. They take a fantastical conflict about magic and make it grounded in moral reality. They remind the reader that the fundamental drivers of violence and oppression, prejudice, the quest for absolute power, and the belief in one's own superiority are the same, whether you're using a magic wand or a machine gun. The Wizarding World's dark history acts as a cautionary tale, drawing on real, painful memories to show that evil isn't just a shadowy figure in a cloak, it's a political ideology that promises power and purity at the expense of others. Rowling's work is constantly reflecting on the fragility of peace and the human cost of tyranny. The Wizarding World of Harry Potter is a stunning fantasy, but it's always had its feet firmly planted in the grim soil of human failings. When you peel back the magic, you see a society riddled with the same injustices and systemic corruption we struggle with every day. The government, the Ministry of Magic, is less a beacon of justice and more a labyrinth of self-serving bureaucracy. It's run by a Ministry of Magic that one critic aptly described as a corrupt, self-perpetuating bureaucracy with no discernible elections or independent legislative branch, allowing the executive to effectively dominate the entire judicial system. The trials Harry faces are less about law and more about political maneuvering, like when the powerful Lucius Malfoy uses his influence to have a creature like the hippogriff Buckbeak sentenced to execution. That's a political favor disguised as a legal process. But the most insidious rot at the heart of this world is the obsession with blood purity. This isn't a mere cultural quirk, it's a foundational, deeply racist ideology that mirrors real-world ethnic cleansing and supremacy movements. The terms themselves, pureblood, half-blood, Muggle-born, and the vile slur mudblood, establish a rigid, hostile caste system. The idea of pureblood status is a biological lie, a historical fiction concocted after the Statute of Secrecy in 1692. Rowling herself explained that centuries of intermarriage meant most self-proclaimed purebloods had no higher proportion of wizarding ancestors than anyone else. Calling yourself a pureblood was, in essence, a political declaration, a promise not to contaminate the magical lineage. The Sacred 28, a list of so-called truly pureblood families published in the 1930s to help maintain bloodlines, became the pureblood aristocracy, and yet families like the Weasleys who championed Muggle rights were scorned as blood traitors despite being on that very list. This shows that the prejudice was not just about genetics, it was about political loyalty to a supremacist worldview. This institutional failure and underlying hatred manifests in no character more chillingly than Dolores Umbridge. She is the physical embodiment of state tyranny, a sadistic bureaucrat who co-opts the mechanisms of government, the Ministry of Magic, to inflict her personal prejudice and cruelty. When Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge installs her as High Inquisitor at Hogwarts, she turns the school into a police state. She doesn't use dark magic, at least not at first. She uses decrees, rules, and government oversight to terrorize children. She legally restricts students' freedom of assembly, bans clubs, and establishes an inquisitorial squad to spy on her peers and teachers. Her power comes directly from the state she serves, and she uses it with smiling, self-righteous impunity. The horror of Umbridge is that she is evil in a very human way. She isn't a magical overlord like Voldemort. She's a paper pusher who enjoys cruelty under the guise of order and tradition. That's why horror master Stephen King famously called her the greatest make-believe villain to come along since Hannibal Lecter. King was making a point. The evil that is terrifyingly relatable is often the one wearing a kitten-themed jumper and signing paperwork. The torture Harry endures at her hands, being forced to write the words, "I must not tell lies," into his own skin with a cursed quill during detention, is a perfect example of bureaucratic sadism. It's not a dramatic duel. It's an institutionalized act of violence sanctioned by a corrupted government official, and it highlights how state power can become an engine of personal vengeance and political oppression. The fact that the Ministry, fearing the truth about Voldemort's return, would install a person who actively persecutes one of the only people speaking the truth demonstrates a government willing to sacrifice public safety for its own political narrative. It shows what happens when fear and a desperate desire to maintain the status quo overcome basic morality, making the institutions meant to protect society its greatest threat. The personal stories of discrimination, like the constant insult of mudblood hurled at Hermione, are a direct line from this institutional failure to the emotional and psychological trauma of the victims. The system itself is weaponized against its own people. The true measure of a society isn't just the corruption of its leaders, but the fire of resistance in the people they oppress. In the wizarding world, this resistance took two distinct yet complementary forms: the Old Guard, represented by the Order of the Phoenix, and the new generation, embodied by Dumbledore's army. The Order of the Phoenix was Dumbledore's creation, an emergency collective built in the shadow of tyranny. It was the response of veterans, of those who had fought Voldemort before and understood the gravity of his return. They were a diverse, inclusive coalition that cut across the artificial blood purity lines, recruiting half-bloods, Muggleborns, and pure-blood sympathizers alike. Their structure was the classic hierarchical model: Dumbledore at the top as the charismatic, strategic leader, and the members acting as his agents, gathering intelligence, guarding targets, and fighting in the shadows. It was a model of necessary, wartime command, emphasizing loyalty and trust, designed to counter the centralized, fear-based cult of Voldemort and the Death Eaters. Voldemort's regime, by contrast, operated on pure, raw fear. His followers, while numerous, were a cult of personality, driven by the promised reward of power and the belief in their own supremacy. His power structure was a simple, brutal pyramid: Voldemort, his inner circle of Death Eaters, and then the terrified, subjugated masses. It was a classic top-down tyranny, where loyalty was enforced by the threat of the Cruciatus Curse. You didn't collaborate with Voldemort, you submitted to him. But the most potent and interesting form of resistance wasn't the Order. It was the one organized by the students themselves: Dumbledore's Army, or DA. This group arose out of necessity and frustration, directly counteracting the Ministry's attempt to neuter Hogwarts through Dolores Umbridge. When Umbridge, acting as the Ministry's agent, refused to let the students practice any defensive magic, Harry, Ron, and Hermione realized they had to take matters into their own hands. The DA was revolutionary because of its structure. It was egalitarian and collaborative, a genuine grassroots movement. Harry wasn't an authority figure in the traditional sense. He was a teacher, chosen by consensus. The students themselves named the group and organized the meetings. They didn't rely on an established government or a powerful, wise old man. They relied on each other. This structure is surprisingly similar to modern collaborative organizational models, sometimes described as turquoise organizations in management theory. Flat, non-hierarchical groups that emphasize self-management and empowerment. In the DA, every member was given an equal voice, an equal right to learn, and an equal stake in their own defense. Harry simply facilitated the learning, but the motivation and the execution belonged to the students. This collective action not only taught them crucial defensive spells, but it also fostered a deep sense of trust and community that transcended house rivalries. A Ravenclaw, a Hufflepuff, a Gryffindor, even a few disillusioned Slytherins, all gathered in the hidden room of requirement, united against a common enemy. The difference in leadership styles is what really defined the two sides. Dumbledore was a leader of vast, almost solitary wisdom, often keeping secrets he felt were necessary to protect those under him. Voldemort was a tyrant of pure, self-serving ambition. Harry, however, was a reluctant, collaborative leader. He didn't want to be in charge, but he accepted the responsibility, empowering others with skills they could use to protect themselves. His leadership was defined by empathy, not authority. When the final battle came, Dumbledore's army proved to be the bedrock of the defense. They were the ones who held the line against the Death Eaters at the Battle of Hogwarts, fighting not out of blind devotion to a great wizard, but out of a shared belief in equality and justice, a belief they had formalized and practiced themselves in that hidden room. They represented a shift toward millennial collaboration, a rejection of failed institutions, and a preference for building new, inclusive systems from the ground up. Their rebellion wasn't just about fighting a Dark Lord, it was about defining a new, better way for their society to govern itself, one founded on the principle that everyone deserves to be empowered and protected regardless of their bloodline. This collective strength, born of self-organization, ultimately became the shield that saved the wizarding world. It's a strange thing to look back at a fantasy world and realize it wasn't just reflecting our reality, but actively foreshadowing it. The Harry Potter series, which captivated a generation as they came of age, laid out a blueprint for the future in ways that were practically prophetic. J.K. Rowling's magical inventions, created in the late 1990s and early 2000s, often predated and mirrored the very technological breakthroughs that defined the millennials' adult lives. One of the most obvious examples is the Marauders map. This enchanted piece of parchment displayed the exact location of every person within Hogwarts Castle in real time. It allowed Harry to see where someone was, where they were going, and where they were supposed to be, granting a level of ubiquitous surveillance and connectivity. The very first book, Philosopher's Stone, was published in 1997. The first major public version of Google Maps wouldn't arrive until 2005. The map was effectively an early concept for a fully realized, personalized, location-tracking global positioning system, something that is now integrated into every smartphone and delivery service we use. Then there's the Flu network and its use for communication. While the network's primary function was transportation, wizards also utilized fireplaces as a kind of high-definition video conferencing system. They could stick their heads into a flame, maintaining a live visual and verbal connection with someone miles away. This was described in the books before the widespread adoption of Skype or other popular video chat services. When Chamber of Secrets was published in 1998, video calling was still largely a sci-fi dream. By 2003, it was becoming a real possibility. Rowling's magic integrated instant travel and global communication into one seamless, if slightly soot-covered system. The idea of the Quick Quotes Quill, a magically sentient writing instrument that could instantly transcribe speech, is a chilling parallel to the rapid rise of generative AI and machine learning tools today. When the quill appears in Goblet of Fire, it's used by Rita Skeeter to crank out instant, if highly embellished, journalistic copy. It's an early, fantastical example of technology automating the creation of content. The idea that a machine could instantly produce text based on input, freeing the user from the manual labor of writing, felt like a joke in 2000. But now, AI writing tools are a daily reality in many professional fields. Perhaps the most philosophical prediction relates to memory. The pensive, a basin used to extract, view, and dive into memories, offers a form of immersive, high-fidelity recall. Characters literally step into the scene of a memory. This is a clear analog to modern virtual reality, VR, and advanced simulation technology. These scenes in the books were published long before the current push for widespread, consumer-grade VR headsets. The pensive suggested a future where experiential data could be perfectly preserved and shared, influencing the way an entire generation of readers now views the potential of virtual reality, not just for gaming, but for education, therapy, and understanding history. The greatest legacy of these visions is how they shaped the cultural view of the millennials who grew up reading them. They were not just entertained by the magic, they were subtly conditioned to accept the premise that powerful, intuitive, and sometimes unsettling technology was both inevitable and potentially dangerous. The series didn't just tell a story about a wizard, it was a prophet of the future, creating a foundational understanding that the true ethical battles of the coming decades wouldn't just be about how to wield power, but how to wield the tools that reshape reality itself. The magic of Harry Potter prepared a generation to expect the extraordinary and to simultaneously be wary of it.